The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the corrugated metal roof of Camp Concordia's infirmary with a sound like distant artillery. Private Takeo Nakamura pressed his face against the window, watching rivulets trace paths down the glass, transforming the Kansas landscape beyond into a watercolor painting of blurred greens and browns. Behind him, the labored breathing of Staff Sergeant Daniel Collins filled the small room. Each inhale a painful struggle that seemed to last an eternity. The American guard had collapsed during morning inspection, his face contorted in agony as he clutched at his chest. Now he lay on the infirmary bed, skin ashen, lips turning a faint blue, despite the oxygen mask strapped to his face. Dr. Reynolds, the camp's only physician, had been called away to a neighboring town after a train derailment. The nurse, overwhelmed with injured farmers from the same accident, moved between patients with increasing desperation.
"His appendix has ruptured," she announced, wiping sweat from her brow. "Without surgery, he'll be dead by morning." Takeo watched from the corner, understanding more English than anyone suspected. He had been brought to clean the floors, a task assigned to prisoners with medical experience. Before the war, he had studied at Tokyo Imperial University's medical school, completing 3 years before being drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. Now, as he saw the guard's life slipping away, something shifted inside him. What would happen if he stepped forward? Would they shoot him for approaching an American? Would they think he meant to harm the guard? Or would they see what he truly offered, the chance to save a life that, enemy or not, deserved to live? The choice before him carried the weight of 2 worlds colliding, each with its own definitions of honor, duty, and humanity. In the silence between thunderclaps, Takeo made his decision.
He set down his mop and stepped forward, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. In halting English, he spoke words that would change everything. "I am doctor. I can help him." The room fell silent except for Collins's ragged breathing. Every eye turned to the Japanese prisoner, wondering if they had heard correctly. Had the enemy just offered to save an American life? And if so, could they possibly trust him with a scalpel over one of their own? The sound of the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when one man offered mercy across battle lines that had divided the world. No one in the room could have imagined how this moment would unfold, or how a single act of compassion would ripple through the camp, challenging everything both sides thought they knew about their enemy. The nurse, Margaret Winters, recovered first, her professional instincts overriding suspicion. "You're a doctor?" she asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Takeo nodded, keeping his eyes lowered in deference, a habit formed during months in captivity. "Medical student, 3 years." He pointed to Collins, whose breathing had grown more labored. "Appendix, needs surgery now." His words were accented but clear, urgent without being demanding. Captain Howard, the ranking officer present, narrowed his eyes. The idea of allowing an enemy combatant to operate on an American soldier was unprecedented, possibly court-martial worthy. Yet Collins's condition deteriorated by the minute, and the nearest surgeon was hours away. "If he dies because you cut him wrong," Howard said slowly, measuring each word, "you'll wish you'd never offered." Takeo met his gaze, something he rarely did with guards. "I will save him," he said simply. What followed was a flurry of activity that defied the rigid boundaries of war. Instruments were gathered, a makeshift operating table prepared. 2 guards stood at attention, rifles ready, while Takeo washed his hands methodically, using techniques learned in Tokyo. The nurse assisted, her movements professionally detached, but her eyes never leaving the prisoner's hands. "Anesthesia?" Takeo asked. "Limited," she responded. "Ether. Enough for 30 minutes at most." Takeo nodded, calculating silently. It would be enough, barely. As he prepared to make the first incision, he whispered a prayer in Japanese that none in the room understood. The blade touched skin, and in that moment, he was no longer prisoner number 423. He was simply a healer, doing what he had trained to do. The operation proceeded with remarkable precision. Takeo's hands moved with confident grace, identifying the ruptured appendix, removing it, cleaning the abdominal cavity of infection. The nurse, initially skeptical, found herself passing instruments without hesitation, recognizing the skill in his movements. Even Captain Howard's rigid posture relaxed slightly as he watched the Japanese prisoner work with undeniable expertise. "Sutures," Takeo requested, and they were placed in his palm without question. As he closed the incision with neat, even stitches, Collins's breathing steadied, his color gradually improving. When it was done, Takeo stepped back, sweat darkening his prison uniform. He bowed slightly, a gesture so ingrained that it emerged even in this most unusual circumstance. "He will live," he said, the weariness in his voice revealing the intense concentration the surgery had required. Captain Howard studied him for a long moment, confusion and reluctant respect warring in his expression. "Take the prisoner back to his quarters," he ordered finally, "and give him an extra ration tonight." As Takeo was led away, the storm outside began to subside, the drumming on the roof fading to a gentle patter. Something had shifted in Camp Concordia, something profound yet invisible. The line between enemy and ally, so clearly drawn on maps and in training manuals, had suddenly blurred in the space of a single hour. What would happen when word spread through the camp? How would the other guards react to owing a Japanese prisoner their comrade's life? And what of the other prisoners, who had been taught that surrender was dishonor, that Americans were devils to be feared and hated? The rain-washed evening promised a night of whispers, of stories spreading from barracks to guard towers, of a worldview beginning to crack along its foundations. The story of Takeo's intervention spread through Camp Concordia like wildfire, igniting reactions as varied as the men who heard it. By breakfast the following morning, American guards clustered in small groups, voices low, eyes occasionally drifting to the Japanese prisoners who ate their rice and beans in disciplined silence. "Collins would be dead if not for that Jap," one guard muttered, the conflicting emotions evident in his tone. He had lost a brother at Pearl Harbor, carried that grief like a stone in his chest for years. Now he found himself in the uncomfortable position of acknowledging that an enemy had saved his fellow guard's life. Among the prisoners, the news created a different kind of tension. Sergeant Masaru Tanaka, once an officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, cornered Takeo between the barracks, his voice a harsh whisper. "You dishonor yourself by aiding the enemy," he hissed in Japanese. "Better to let the American die than to betray your oath to the Emperor." Takeo met his gaze steadily. "I took an oath as a doctor first," he replied, "to preserve life when I can." "And what of the lives of our countrymen?" Tanaka pressed, stepping closer. "Did you preserve them when these Americans bombed Tokyo? When they burned women and children?" The question hung between them, heavy with accusation. Takeo had no easy answer. He had seen the photographs smuggled into camp, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, families erased in an instant. Yet he had also witnessed something unexpected in the infirmary, the raw humanity of watching Americans fight to save one of their own, the same desperate care he had seen in field hospitals on the Japanese side. "I did what I believed was right," he said finally, "as I would for any man." Tanaka spat at his feet, a gesture of contempt that needed no translation. As he walked away, other prisoners watched from the shadows, their expressions unreadable. Some nodded subtly to Takeo, a silent acknowledgement of respect. Others turned away, the shame of captivity deepened by what they perceived as collaboration. 3 days later, Staff Sergeant Collins was well enough to sit up. Captain Howard, against regulations, brought Takeo to the infirmary under guard. The two men, savior and saved, regarded each other across a divide far greater than the few feet that separated them. "They tell me you cut out what was killing me," Collins said finally, his southern drawl softened by lingering weakness. Takeo nodded, unsure how to respond. Why? The question was direct, without embellishment. Why help the enemy? It was the same question Tanaka had asked, but from the opposite side of the war. Takeo considered his words carefully,
aware that his limited English might fail to convey the complexity of his feelings. "I am doctor," he said simply. "You are patient." Collins studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand, a gesture so unexpected that even the guards shifted uncomfortably. Takeo hesitated, then took it, feeling the strength returning to the American's grip. "Thank you," Collins said, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested.
As Takeo was escorted back to his barracks, he noticed subtle changes in how the guards regarded him. No longer just another faceless enemy and identical prison guard, he had become an individual with skills, with humanity. Some nodded to him, a slight acknowledgement that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. That evening, an unusual delivery arrived at the prisoner's mess hall. A crate of oranges, bright splashes of color in the drab surroundings. The guard announcing their arrival didn't specify that they were a gift from Collins's family, but everyone understood the implicit message. As the fruit was distributed, Takeo peeled his orange slowly, the scent transporting him instantly to his father's small garden in Kyoto. Across the mess hall, he noticed a young guard watching him, curiosity replacing the habitual suspicion. For a brief moment, they were just two men enjoying the simple pleasure of fresh fruit, the barriers between them momentarily translucent, if not yet transparent. What neither of them could have predicted was how this small beginning would grow, or how the dynamics of the entire camp would shift around the gravitational pull of a single act of compassion. In the coming weeks, the rigid lines that separated captor from captive would blur in ways that military regulations never anticipated, challenging both sides to see beyond the uniforms that defined them. As winter descended on the Kansas plains, the temperamental furnace in Barrack C sputtered and died, leaving 40 Japanese prisoners shivering in temperatures that dropped below freezing at night. Regulations stated that enemy prisoners should receive adequate shelter, but with coal shortages affecting even American homes, replacing the broken parts was low priority. Teo, now unofficially recognized as the camp medic's assistant, reported cases of frostbite appearing among the older prisoners. He waited outside the administration building for 2 hours in the biting cold until Captain Howard appeared. "Sir," he said, bowing slightly from habit, "men very cold, some sick already." Howard frowned, not from anger, but from the genuine dilemma. Resources were stretched thin, and American families were rationing coal. How could he justify prioritizing enemy comfort? "I'll see what we can do," he replied non-committally. It was Collins, still recovering but back on light duty, who found the solution. He organized a rotation of kerosene heaters from the guards' quarters, ensuring each barracks received some warmth for at least part of the night. When another guard protested, Collins responded with unexpected heat. "You want to explain to headquarters why we lost prisoners to cold when we could have prevented it?" he demanded. "Or maybe you'd prefer we act like they treated our boys in their camps." The reference hung in the air, uncomfortable and undeniable. Reports had filtered back about the brutal conditions in Japanese-controlled POW camps in the Pacific, where American prisoners starved or froze or died from untreated wounds. The contrast with Camp Concordia, where prisoners received 3 meals daily and medical care, was stark. "We ain't them," Collins said more quietly. "That's the whole point." The heater rotation began that night. When the warm air first flowed through Barrack C, Private Ichiro Sato, once a schoolteacher from Osaka, looked up from the letter he was writing. "In Japan," he said softly in surprisingly good English, "they tell us Americans would torture us if captured, that we would starve while they watched." "That what you believed?" asked the guard supervising the heater installation. Sato nodded. "Many still believe it," he admitted, gesturing to the other prisoners who watched the exchange warily. "They think this kindness is trick, that something worse comes later." The guard, barely 20 years old and from a farm in Nebraska, seemed genuinely perplexed. "Why would we do that?" "Because that is war," Sato replied simply. "To destroy enemy completely." The young guard shook his head. "That's not how we see it," he said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure what we collectively believed anymore. The complexities of treating enemy prisoners humanely while their compatriots still killed Americans in the Pacific created moral ambiguities no training manual had prepared him for.
That same week, an unusual request arrived from Camp Concordia's commander. Takeo was to assist the camp physician with a growing number of civilian patients from the surrounding community. The local doctor had been drafted, leaving a shortage of medical care for the rural population. The first American civilian patients regarded Takeo with undisguised suspicion. Women clutched their purses tighter. Men watched his every movement with narrowed eyes. Yet, as he demonstrated his skill, setting a child's broken arm, diagnosing an elderly farmer's heart condition, delivering twins during a complicated birth, the fear gradually gave way to cautious acceptance. "Never thought I'd let a Japanese doctor touch my grandchild," confessed an elderly woman after Takeo successfully treated her grandson's pneumonia. "But you got gentle hands, I'll give you that." These interactions, limited as they were, offered Takeo glimpses of American life beyond propaganda. He saw photographs of families proudly displayed, heard stories of sons fighting in the Pacific, perhaps against his own countrymen, and witnessed the same parental worries, the same love of children, the same hopes for peace that would have been familiar in any Japanese village. Did these Americans truly understand that the same humanity existed in Tokyo, in Kyoto, in the small fishing village where he had spent childhood summers with his grandparents? Could they imagine Japanese mothers treasuring photographs, Japanese fathers working the land with calloused hands, Japanese children playing games not so different from their own? As spring approached, bringing the sweet scent of prairie wildflowers through the barbed wire, the dynamic within Camp Concordia had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Guards and prisoners still maintained their prescribed roles, but moments of genuine connection punctuated the routine. A shared joke during work detail, an exchange of family stories, small kindnesses offered without fanfare. The transformation was most visible in the interactions between Collins and Takeo, who now worked together in the infirmary 3 days a week. Their initial cautious gratitude had evolved into a professional relationship that occasionally, when no one was watching too closely, resembled friendship. The true test of this fragile new understanding was about to arrive, challenging both sides to determine just how much humanity could survive the brutal realities of a war that still raged across the Pacific. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, its official military envelope immediately recognizable to everyone in Camp Concordia. Captain Howard read it privately first, his face growing grimmer with each paragraph. Then he called an assembly of all guards, delivering the news without embellishment. Collins's younger brother, a Marine in the Pacific, had been killed in action on Okinawa. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just days earlier, news had reached the camp of the desperate Japanese defense of the island, including civilian suicides rather than surrender. The mood among the guards had darkened instantly, old hatreds rekindling as they imagined their countrymen facing an enemy that seemed incomprehensibly alien in its ferocity. Collins didn't appear for duty the following day, or the next. When he finally returned, his face was etched with grief that had hardened into something more dangerous. He walked past Takeo in the infirmary without acknowledgement, his movements mechanical, his eyes focused on some middle distance where perhaps his brother still lived. The other guards watched Collins carefully, recognizing the volatile mixture of sorrow and rage that simmered just beneath his disciplined exterior. Some gave him wide berth, while others attempted awkward consolations that fell woefully short of addressing the immensity of his loss. It was Private Lewis, a young guard from Mississippi, who finally said what many were thinking. "If I were him, I'd want 5 minutes alone with any Jap I could get my hands on." The comment, spoken in the guards' mess hall, traveled through the camp's efficient rumor network until it reached the Japanese barracks. That night, the prisoners huddled in smaller groups than usual, the unspoken fear of retribution hanging heavy in the air. Teo found himself isolated, neither fully trusted by his fellow prisoners nor welcomed by the Americans. He alone seemed to occupy the precarious middle ground between two worlds locked in mortal combat, understanding both, yet belonging to neither. 3 days after receiving the news, Collins approached Takeo during the quiet afternoon hours in the infirmary. His eyes were bloodshot, his uniform slightly rumpled, details that spoke volumes about his mental state. "My brother was 20, he said without preamble, his voice flat. "Just a kid. Never even had a chance to get married, have a family. Takeo remained silent, recognizing that no response could possibly be adequate. They say he died quick, Collins continued, staring out the window. But that's what they always say, isn't it? Nobody tells the family if their boy suffered. He turned then, fixing Takeo with a gaze that contained too many emotions to name. You people don't surrender. You fight until there's nothing left. Why? What makes you throw away lives like that? It was a genuine question, beneath the anger and incomprehension. Takeo weighed his limited English against the complexity of explaining concepts like honor, duty, and the Japanese soul to a grieving American. We are taught, he said carefully, death with honor better than life with shame. And that's worth dying for? Worth killing for? The questions came rapid-fire, demanding rather than curious. Your brother, Takeo said softly, he died for what he believed too, yes? For America? Collins flinched as if struck. For a moment, Takeo feared he had gone too far, that the tenuous connection between them would snap under the weight of grief and national differences too vast to bridge. Then, unexpectedly, Collins nodded, a single sharp movement acknowledging the truth in the observation. Yeah, he said. He did. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it held something important. A recognition that beneath the flags and uniforms and training, both sides sent their young men to die for beliefs that seemed self-evident to them, incomprehensible to the other. Later that day, something unprecedented occurred. During evening count, Collins approached Sergeant Tanaka, the staunchest traditionalist among the Japanese prisoners. In full view of the assembled men, he handed him a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. I'm told you lost your son at Midway, Collins said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. Pilot, right? Tanaka stiffened, surprise briefly overcoming his habitual stoicism. He nodded once, sharply. Then we got something in common now, Collins continued. Open it when you're alone. The package contained a small carved woods eagle, the kind of folk art common in rural America. Later, prisoners would whisper that Tanaka kept it hidden in his footlocker, taking it out only when he thought no one was watching. Whether this was true remained speculation, but something undeniable had occurred in that exchange, a recognition of shared loss that transcended enemy lines. What would happen as more news arrived from the Pacific, as more brothers and sons on both sides perished in a war that seemed to grow more savage with each island campaign? Could the fragile humanity glimpsed within Camp Concordia survive the weight of mounting casualties and national hatreds? The summer brought suffocating heat to the Kansas plains, the kind that shimmered above the horizon and turned the camp into an oven of metal and dust. Work details were shortened, water rations increased. In this punishing environment, tensions that had eased during spring began to resurface. News of kamikaze attacks reached the American guards, stories of Japanese pilots deliberately crashing into ships, taking dozens of American sailors with them. The concept was so alien, so terrifying in its dedication, that it rekindled fears of an enemy fundamentally different from themselves. Among the Japanese prisoners, rumors circulated about American firebombing of civilian targets in Japan, entire cities engulfed in flames that consumed women, children, and the elderly without distinction. Each new report hardened something in the men who had begun, cautiously, to see their captors as human. It was against this backdrop that the incident occurred, an event so unexpected that it would come to symbolize both the worst and best of what humans could be to one another in wartime. The supply truck arrived late, delayed by a flat tire on the rural Kansas roads. By the time it reached Camp Concordia, the sun was setting, painting the sky in spectacular oranges and purples that went largely unappreciated by the tired driver and his equally exhausted guard escort. Prisoners were assigned to unload the heavy crates of canned goods and medical supplies. Among them was Takeo, whose presence in work details had become routine despite his special status in the infirmary. Collins supervised. His grief now settled into the kind of quiet sadness that no longer threatened to explode but never fully disappeared. What happened next occurred so quickly that accounts would later differ in details, though not in essence. The truck's brakes failed as the driver stepped out, sending the vehicle rolling backward down the slight incline toward the unloading area. Collins shouted a warning, but the noise of crates being stacked drowned out his voice. Takeo saw the movement first, the massive truck gaining momentum as it rolled toward where the driver now stood frozen in its path. Without hesitation, he dropped the crate he was carrying and sprinted forward, shoving the American clear with such force that both men tumbled to the side. Collins, running toward them, saw the truck's wheel catch Takeo's leg, heard the sickening crack of bone, witnessed the Japanese prisoner's face contort in agony before discipline reasserted itself and he went still, teeth clenched against the pain. What followed was chaos, guards rushing forward, prisoners backing away, the truck finally halting as it hit a concrete barrier. Collins reached Takeo first, kneeling beside him, assessing the damage with practiced eyes. The leg was badly broken, bone visible through torn flesh. "Get the doctor," he shouted, already removing his belt to fashion a tourniquet above the wound. "And bring a stretcher." As he worked to stem the bleeding, Collins became aware that Takeo was watching him, eyes clear, despite the pain that must have been excruciating. Their gazes met, and something passed between them, an understanding too profound for words. "You saved him," Collins said, quietly. "Why?" Takeo's answer came through gritted teeth, his English precise despite his suffering. "Same reason I save you. Life is life." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air between them, a truth so fundamental that it cut through layers of training, propaganda, and national identity. In that moment, they were not American and Japanese, not guard and prisoner, but simply two men facing mortality together. When the stretcher arrived, it was Collins who insisted on accompanying Takeo to the infirmary, who stood by during treatment, who refused to leave until assured the prisoner would recover. The other guards watched this display with reactions ranging from approval to discomfort, uncertain what to make of such loyalty to an enemy. The truck driver, a civilian contractor named Frank Miller, sat in shock, repeating the same phrases. "He pushed me clear. The Jap saved my life. Why would he do that?" No one had a simple answer. Even Captain Howard, summoned to the scene, found himself at a loss to explain actions that defied everything they had been taught about the enemy. That Japanese were fanatical, that they valued American lives not at all, that they were fundamentally different in their humanity. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, written in blood on the dusty ground of Camp Concordia. A Japanese prisoner had risked his life, perhaps given it, though the doctor was cautiously optimistic, to save an American he didn't know, who represented the nation that had bombed his homeland and killed his countrymen. That night, an unprecedented scene unfolded in the camp infirmary. Guards brought food from their own mess hall rather than the prisoners' rations, offering it to the injured man. Japanese prisoners, granted special permission by Captain Howard, came in small groups to pay respects to their comrade. Most surprising of all, Frank Miller arrived with his wife and young daughter. The child, no more than 7, carried wildflowers picked from the roadside. She approached Takeo's bed with the solemn curiosity of youth, placing the bouquet on his bedside table with careful precision. "Thank you for saving my daddy," she said, the words rehearsed but sincere. Takeo, groggy from morphine but conscious, managed a smile that transformed his face from stoic prisoner to simply a man touched by a child's gratitude. "You are welcome," he replied, his accent making the familiar phrase sound new. As the Miller family left, the little girl waving from the doorway, Collins remained in the chair beside the bed. Outside, the Kansas sunset painted the sky in colors that reminded Takeo of festivals in Kyoto, of lanterns floating on rivers, of a world that seemed impossibly distant now. "Your family," Collins asked suddenly, "in Japan, they know you're alive?" Takeo nodded. Red Cross letters, very short. "You got kids?" A shadow passed across Takeo's face. "Daughter. 4 years when I leave. Now," he struggled to calculate, 7. Collins absorbed this. The image of a little Japanese girl waiting for a father who might never return, forming unbidden in his mind. It was painfully easy to superimpose her features onto the Miller child who had just left. The same innocence, the same trust in adults to make the world make sense. "What will you tell her," Collins asked, "about all this, about us?" It was the question that haunted both sides, though rarely spoken aloud. What stories would they tell when the war ended? Would they speak of hate, of atrocities, of irreconcilable differences? Or would there be room in their narratives for moments like this, for common humanity discovered in the most unlikely circumstances? Takeo was silent for so long that Collins thought perhaps he hadn't understood the question. Finally, he spoke, his words careful, deliberate. "I will tell her I meet Americans. Some good, some not, like Japanese. Just people." The simplicity of the statement belied its radical nature. In a world divided by total war, where propaganda on both sides painted the enemy as monstrous and fundamentally different, such recognition of shared humanity was revolutionary. Neither man spoke for some time after that. The infirmary grew quiet as evening deepened. The only sounds the soft footfalls of the nurse making her rounds and the distant calls of meadowlarks returning to their nests. What would happen when these men returned to their respective countries, carrying memories that contradicted official narratives? How would they reconcile what they had been taught with what they had lived? And, in the telling and retelling of their war stories, which truths would survive? The answers to these questions lay in the future, but something undeniable had already occurred in Camp Concordia, a recognition that transcended uniforms, languages, and the artificial boundaries of nation and creed. As summer faded into autumn, Takeo's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The compound fracture required multiple surgeries, each performed by the camp physician with Takeo conscious, providing guidance when asked. His stoicism during these painful procedures impressed even the most hardened guards, who spoke of it with reluctant admiration. "Never makes a sound," Private Lewis remarked. "Just lies there while they're digging in his leg." Gotta respect that kind of grit. News from the Pacific grew increasingly grim. Reports of fighting on Okinawa described a level of ferocity that shocked even veterans. Japanese soldiers fighting to the death, civilians committing suicide rather than accept American occupation. These stories circulated among the guards, rekindling suspicions and fears that had begun to ease. Yet within Camp Concordia, a strange parallel reality had emerged. The Japanese prisoners, still the enemy in theory, had become individuals with names, stories, and distinctive personalities. Guards who had once seen them as an undifferentiated mass now recognized Tanaka's rigid formality, Sato's quiet intelligence, Takeo's steady competence. The most significant transformation appeared in unexpected places. Mess hall conversations where guards debated the morality of strategic bombing. Off-duty hours where photographs of families were cautiously shared across national lines. Evening cigarette breaks where the universal language of gesture bridged linguistic divides. Captain Howard, observing these changes with mixed feelings, confided to the camp chaplain, "I'm not sure if what's happening here is right or wrong anymore. These men are still the enemy, but when Miller's kid brought those flowers, I don't know, it gets complicated." The chaplain, a Baptist minister from Tennessee who had served in the First World War, offered a perspective that surprised the captain with its simplicity. "Seems to me, treating them as human isn't disrespecting our boys fighting overseas. Might be the very thing they're fighting for, to be better than what they're fighting against." The philosophical implications of this statement lingered long after the conversation ended. If American identity included treating enemies with humanity, then showing compassion to Japanese prisoners wasn't a betrayal of the war effort, but an affirmation of its deeper purpose. In October, as leaves turned golden across the Kansas landscape, Frank Miller returned to Camp Concordia with an unusual request. His family owned a small farm nearby, and with harvest approaching and labor shortages critical due to the war, he needed help. Specifically, he asked for Takeo, now able to walk with a crutch, and any other prisoners Captain Howard could spare. The request created a procedural nightmare. Regulations permitted prisoner labor for essential war production, but made no provisions for private farms. Yet food production was vital to the war effort, and Miller's corn would feed American soldiers if not harvested soon. After consultation with higher authorities, Howard approved a limited work detail. 10 prisoners, including Takeo, would assist with the harvest under guard supervision. The Japanese volunteers received the news with mixed reactions, some seeing it as an opportunity to escape the monotony of camp life, others suspicious of American motives. What awaited them at the Miller farm defied all expectations. The modest farmhouse, weathered but well-maintained, sat amid fields ready for harvest. Martha Miller, Frank's wife, had prepared a lunch for everyone, guards and prisoners alike, to be served at the same long table in the yard. The guards shifted uncomfortably at this arrangement, looking to Collins for guidance. He hesitated only briefly before taking a seat, indicating the prisoners should do the same. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable meal of the war, Americans and Japanese sharing bread, roast chicken, and apple pie under the open sky. Conversation was minimal, limited by language barriers and the strangeness of the situation. Yet in the simple act of passing dishes, of nodding thanks, of enjoying the same food prepared by the same hands, something profound occurred. For a brief afternoon, the war seemed distant, an abstraction, compared to the immediate reality of hunger satisfied and work shared. After the meal, as the men moved into the fields to begin harvesting, 7-year-old Emma Miller approached Takeo with solemn determination. She carried a small object wrapped in cloth, offering it with the directness unique to children. "This is for your daughter," she announced, in Japan. Unwrapping the gift revealed a handmade doll dressed in calico, its yarn hair braided neatly, its button eyes sewn with careful stitches. Takeo held it with reverent hands, understanding the significance of such a gift in wartime when materials were rationed and toys scarce. "Thank you," he said, the English words inadequate for the emotion behind them. "My Haru will treasure this." The work proceeded efficiently. Prisoners and Americans falling into the rhythm of harvest that transcends cultural differences. By sunset, when the trucks returned them to Camp Concordia, something had shifted once again. The boundaries between captive and captor, enemy and ally, had blurred further in the shared endeavor of bringing food from the earth. That night, as Takeo carefully placed the doll in his footlocker beside the few possessions allowed him, Sergeant Tanaka approached. The older man had maintained his distance since Takeo's operation on Collins, viewing such cooperation with suspicion. Now he stood awkwardly, clearly struggling with what he had witnessed at the farm. "The Americans," he said finally in Japanese, "they are not what we were told." It was as close to a concession as the proud sergeant could make. Takeo nodded, understanding the magnitude of this admission from a man who had lost a son to American bombs. "Nor are we what they were told," he replied quietly. The two men sat in silence as darkness fell over the camp, each contemplating a world where absolutes had given way to complex, contradictory truths. Beyond the barbed wire, the vast Kansas sky filled with stars, the same stars visible from Tokyo, from Washington, from battlefields across the Pacific, where other men, perhaps not so different from themselves, continued to kill and die for causes that seemed increasingly remote from the human connections formed in this unlikely place. Would these moments of shared humanity survive the war? Could the understanding glimpsed in Camp Concordia spread beyond its boundaries to shape the peace that must eventually follow the bloodshed? Or would national hatreds reassert themselves, burying these fragile connections beneath monuments to fallen soldiers and narratives of unambiguous victory? The answer lay somewhere in the future, in the stories these men would tell their children and grandchildren, in the quiet moments when veterans on both sides would remember not only the horror of war, but also its unexpected moments of grace. Perhaps in these tellings, in living rooms in Kansas and Kyoto alike, the full truth of what it means to recognize an enemy as human might finally find voice. For now, in the deepening autumn of 1945, as news of strange new weapons and imminent Japanese surrender filtered into Camp Concordia, the men who had crossed the boundaries of nationality and hatred could only hold to what they had discovered, that compassion is not a betrayal of country, but an affirmation of something deeper and more enduring, our common humanity, which persists even in war's darkest hours. This is the legacy of places like Camp Concordia, of men like Takeo and Collins, not grand policies or military strategies, but small, profound moments when enemies looked beyond uniform and flag to recognize themselves in each other.
Perhaps in these quiet stories of unexpected connection lies our greatest hope for a world where such recognition comes before the bloodshed, not after.